I bet I can show you a Greek inscription that will change the way you read the New Testament forever. When I was in grad school, I got really into doing a lot of work with inscriptions and papyri. Papyri are ancient sources on paper, and inscriptions are writings carved in stone. And even though we have a lot of manuscripts and written sources from antiquity, inscriptions often give us a glimpse into a history we don't always see in the privileged elite people who often wrote the manuscripts or the literature. Inscriptions are a little window into social history. In other words, an inscription in Greek or Latin or Hebrew or another language carved on stone gives us a sense of what life was like for everyday people who didn't always make it into the literature. And I remember in grad school reading this inscription that I'm about to share with you, and I don't think I realized at the time how wild it actually is if you understand the implications of what this inscription says. But before we start, my name is Chris. This channel is dedicated to all things Christianity, ancient and modern, but I focus a little more on the ancient. I have a Master of Divinity, an MA in Theology, and a PhD in Christian origins. So that's mostly where I hang out, and that's where I'm hanging out today. So I want to take you to an island called Delos, and I did a lot of work in inscriptions from Delos during my PhD. The reason is Delos was a city, a port, a trading spot that really thrived during the Hellenistic age. The Romans made it a free port in 166 BC, and it thrived for about 100 years before it was destroyed. But what happened is that when Delos was abandoned, it was just left there. And now we have this incredible island that basically serves as a time capsule for what life was like in the Hellenistic world. So for my thesis, I worked a lot in inscriptions that were made by immigrant groups on Delos to help understand how ancient immigrant groups moved around. And there was this one inscription that stayed with me. It's an inscription that was found next to a building that the excavators of Delos called a synagogue. This inscription says, "The Israelites on Delos who make contribution to the sanctuary Gerizim, crown with a gold crown Serapion, son of Jason of Knossos, for his benefactions toward them." And then the second part of it says, "The Israelites who make contribution to the holy sanctuary Gerizim honor Menipos, son of Artemidoros of Heraklion, both himself and his descendants, for constructing and dedicating out of his own funds." So this is all we get. And sometimes with inscriptions, this is all we get. But sometimes a little bit is a lot, because if you really pay attention, there's something here that will change the way you read the New Testament. Seriously. Let me look at who these people are. The Israelites on Delos who make contribution to the sanctuary Gerizim. What the heck is Gerizim? Well, in Hebrew, Har is mountain, so Gerizim is Mount Gerizim. This group of people on Delos call themselves Israelites, but they're the Israelites who make contributions to Gerizim at Mount Gerizim. These people are actually what would later be called Samaritans. You've probably heard of Samaritans if you ever read the New Testament, and even if you haven't, you might even know the famous story of the Good Samaritan. The question of who the Samaritans were and how they lived in relationship to Jews is really fascinating, and I think hasn't even been studied as well as it could, and hopefully there will be a lot more work done on this in the future. So what do we know about Samaritans? Samaritans, like Jews, practiced circumcision and they followed the law. We even have a copy of their scriptures called the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is almost identical to the Hebrew Bible except for in a few important ways. And when I did a Hebrew Bible text criticism course, we were often looking at the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Dead Sea Scrolls and what's called the Masoretic text, which is the later Hebrew manuscripts, and how they relate together. The Samaritan Pentateuch is part of how we understand the Hebrew Bible that you use today. We don't really know much about where this group of people came from, but here we have this group in diaspora calling themselves Israelites who worship at Mount Gerizim. And in fact, one of the main differences between Samaritans and Jews that is easy for us to discern is which mountain they thought God had commanded them to worship at. And in the Samaritan Pentateuch, one of the most important differences is a textual tradition difference where God commands the Israelites to build an altar not on Mount Ebal, but in Mount Gerizim. It could be that the Samaritans changed the manuscript to align with their own theology, that Mount Gerizim was the place where God wanted to be worshipped, but there was even a manuscript found at Qumran that said the same thing. Oh wait, I misspoke. There is a very important distinction here. This text was claimed to have come from Qumran, but it was actually bought on the antiquities market, which always makes the water more muddy, so we don't have 100% certainty of where it came from. Another fascinating discussion, but not what I'm going to talk about today, because I think one of the most interesting problems if you're looking at this inscription is that these people do not use the word Samaritan. They don't say we are the Samaritans, they say we are the Israelites who worship at Mount Gerizim. And this is part of the problem with finding Samaritans in antiquity, because the Samaritan diaspora is often hiding in plain sight. We know that in the Mediterranean, Samaritans and Jews may have lived beside each other, and often they did, and we even know about occasional conflicts they had with each other. But for all intents and purposes, they were often seen as the same ethnic group. Josephus talks about Samaritans and Jews in Alexandria fighting over, guess what? Who had the proper place of worship? Which mountain they should be worshiping on? And Josephus also reports that Samaritans and Jews were captured by Ptolemy and brought to Egypt together. In fact, we even have papyrological records from a town in the Fayum that was called Samaria. But what's crazy is that the occupants of Samaria, according to this papyrus, are called Jews, Judeos. And this sort of illustrates an enormous problem, that in material culture, in a lot of remains, you can't actually tell the difference between Jews and Samaritans. And for a lot of onlookers, and maybe even for some communities themselves, it's not really clear that there was that much of a difference between Jews and Samaritans. In fact, one of the only real clues we get when we find synagogues is whether or not that synagogue is pointed towards Mount Gerizim or to Jerusalem. So I stumbled over this inscription again a couple weeks ago as I was thinking about content for the channel, and I started reading some interesting work by people doing Samaritan studies. Two people I'll mention in particular, Reinhard Pommer and Martina Bohm. But there's one important thing I had never realized until I started reading these Samaritan scholars. And here it is. Samaritan did not exist as a unique identity in the first century. In fact, it was about the end of the first century when people start to be called Samaritans. And this holds up when we look at other sources. For example, the book of Ben Sira just calls Samaritans the foolish people who dwell in Shechem. Doesn't actually use the word Samaritans. And here in our inscription in the 2nd century BC, these people don't even call themselves Samaritans. They call themselves Israelites. So what does it mean to understand that there weren't people running around in the 1st century calling themselves Samaritans? And what does it mean to understand that these people call themselves Israelites? If you actually get this, this is what will change the way you read the New Testament. Because for some reason, Samaritans hold an outsized influence on the New Testament. You see them, for example, in Luke, where you get the story of the Good Samaritan. You get the story of Jesus going into a Samaritan village and they refuse to give him hospitality because he's trying to go towards Jerusalem. You get this story in Luke 17 of 10 lepers being healed and only one comes back to say thank you. And what does Luke add about this guy's identity? He was Samaritan. You even get Samaritans mentioned several times as a group in Acts, as well as Philip going to preach in Samaria. There's also the story in John about the woman at the well who is Samaritan. And what does this woman say to Jesus? She talks about how her ancestors worship on this mountain. And Jesus says this famous thing about how there's a time coming when followers will worship in spirit and in truth. So you do get Samaritans in the New Testament. The Samaritans are obviously really important to New Testament writers. They actually, often if you look, Samaritans are viewed favorably, while Jews are often not viewed favorably. All of these things are exciting, but here's the thing that might change the way you read the Bible forever. Because remember from Samaritan studies that Samaritan wasn't a unique identity until the end of the 1st century. People don't call themselves Samaritans. And that might explain why, when we look at our earliest sources for the New Testament, we may have Samaritans hiding there. So when we have Luke, we have Acts, these are later writings. It could even be into the 2nd century. John is end of the 1st century. Matthew mentions Samaritans later in the 1st century. But what about the writings of Paul? Remember, Samaritan as an identifier doesn't exist in the time of Paul. Paul doesn't ever use the word Samaritan. But who were the Samaritans? Samaritans were people who called themselves Israelites, who considered themselves descendants of Abraham. They practiced the Jewish law. They practiced circumcision. They read the scriptures. So when you go back into the writings of Paul and you start to see how often he talks about these vague categories of Israelite, people who read the scriptures, descendants of Abraham, etc., the circumcision is huge in Paul, you might be looking at evidence that Paul actually knows about a group that would be later called Samaritans. And these people sort of seem to function as people who are like similar to Jews, but not identical. For example, let's look at 1 Corinthians 9:20, where Paul says, "To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law." But why does Paul say this thing about to the Jews, I became like a Jew, to those under the law, I became like one under the law? Aren't Jews the ones under the law? Isn't this redundant? Well, if we actually read this, understanding that in the Jewish diaspora, there may have been people who didn't call themselves Jews, but who still practiced the law, you might be looking at Samaritans. Paul might actually be talking about Samaritans here. And if you go through Paul's writing and see how often he uses the word Israelite, now there was no place called Israel during the time that Paul's writing. It's often thought that Paul is using this term fictively, but could it be that when Paul uses the word Israel or Hebrew or descendants of Abraham or the generic, the circumcised, instead of Jews in some places, maybe he's talking about Jews and Samaritans. Maybe the circumcised actually refers to multiple groups of people that would later actually be considered multiple ethnicities or multiple identities. In fact, if we look at what Origen says about how Paul uses people under the law, Origen actually believes that Paul here was talking about the Samaritans too, that the Samaritans were also under the law. And there's one more thing that's really interesting, because as you look at the Gospels, you realize that Samaritans play an outsized role in the latest Gospels, but there's a really notable omission. You never read about Samaritans in the Gospel of Mark. How come you have Luke, all these stories about Samaritans, and in the Gospel of Mark, you don't have the word Samaritan once? You don't have one mention of the people who are Samaritans. To me, this could have implications for how we understand how the Gospels are evolving. And also, I've often argued the Gospels aren't eyewitness accounts, so why do these stories about Samaritans get added in later? Is it because Gospel writers just forgot to mention all these occasions where Jesus met Samaritans? Or is it because these are different legends and stories that are being worked in and they only make sense at the end of the first century once you have a unique group of people called the Samaritans? As you can see from this really brief overview, these are all questions that Samaritan studies will shake up in the future. So if you're thinking of going to do a PhD or a master's degree, maybe you should go do something on Samaritan studies, because there are lots of questions here that haven't even been answered yet. Samaritan studies is a pretty small field, and it's often being overlooked in favor of the much bigger and much more popular Jewish studies, but it's an important field in its own right too. So coming full circle, these Israelites on Delos worshipped at Mount Gerizim, Har Gerizim, but they never called themselves Samaritans. And this is evidence of a unique group of people who followed the Jewish law, who built synagogues, who did circumcision, all of these things that they had in common with the Jews, but they often were overlooked. But if we actually stop and read inscriptions like this and look at material culture to understand how ancient diaspora groups of people work, it can completely change the way we read the New Testament. And I hope, I made a bet with you at the beginning, but I hope this inscription changes the way you read the New Testament forever too. And next time you see a story about a Samaritan, maybe you'll think about it a little bit differently. If this video was interesting to you, please do take a moment and subscribe, hit that bell icon. I've got lots of videos coming your way, and I love doing stuff like this on Christian origins and the New Testament, and basically trying to understand where this movement came from and how it evolved. If you have a minute, leave a comment down below. Let me know, did you know about the Samaritans? Did you realize there was so many interesting questions connected to them? I'd love to hear what you think. Any other questions you might have or comments, always love to read those, and I will take as much time to respond to as many as I possibly can. So that's it for this time. And until next time, thanks for watching.